Um,
Way.
I wish that we could be doing this in Assisi and walking those streets and enjoying a cappuccino or gelato. Um, but life is what it is, and we're here in little computer boxes. But 10, 15 years ago, we couldn't be doing this. So God is good. I posed a question for you. Who was Clare? Or who is Clare? Was she merely some inconsequential founder of a group of nuns or a single monastery? Because the Clare monasteries to this day, although many of them are in federations, they're all autonomous. Or was she, as the feminists like to remind us, the first woman to write and receive approval of a religious rule for other women? Or was she merely, as Liliana Cavani in her film Francesca would have us believe, she was one of the boys until the church intervened and made her remember that she was a woman and therefore not free to roam around the countryside? Was she, as some authors say, a holy anorexic who ruined her life, her health by fasting and holding on to what she believed in, a valiant woman who held obstinately to what she believed in, and even in the face of popes, princes, and princesses? I would say she was all of the above, except maybe for the adjective inconsequential. I have a master's degree in Franciscan studies from the University of St. Bonaventure, and in my years there, we had exactly this many courses on Clare of Assisi, not even her writings, because basically that's what she was considered, just a founder of the Poor Clares, and they have nothing to say to us because they're hidden away in some enclosure praying for us. And that's fine, but you know, they're really not very important. Well, that hasn't lasted very long. Since the late 19th century, there has been an explosion of Franciscan studies. And since maybe the last 20 years of the 20th century, there has been an explosion of Clarion studies. One of the first who brought her an awareness of her to the English-speaking world was a friend of mine, Sister Margaret Carney, with her book, or actually her doctoral dissertation on Clare of Assisi, the first Franciscan woman. Margaret lived with us in Rome while she studied at the Antonianum and had the bedroom next to mine while she was writing that work. And basically she said, hey, if you're a Franciscan or want to follow Jesus like Francis did, you can't ignore Clare because she lived a life 30 years longer than Francis. I mean, Francis died in 1226, Clare in 1253. Do the math. She was a Franciscan longer than he was. And she has a lot to say to any of us. I need to add my usual caveat. You know, we talk so much about Francis and today Clare of Assisi, but they followed Jesus. And whenever we speak of Franciscan living, or as the people in Latin America say, Francisclarian living, we're really talking about following Jesus, which is a call of every Christian. So with that caveat in mind, let's start a little bit looking at the history of the time in Assisi when Clare and Francis came on the scene. We speak of probably the Dark Ages as the fall of the Roman Empire till around 1050. You know that there was a political vacuum, and throughout Italy, the Pope was the one who really was the temporal ruler. And with 1050, with the election of Cardinal Hildebrand, a monk from a Germanic family living in northern Italy, who began a reform which we sort of associate with Gregorian music, but he reformed a lot more of the church structure, and there was also an outpouring of interest in living the gospel, and some of these groups were also anti-church and anti-religion. It was also a time of heresy, a revival of the Manichaean heresy, a dualist heresy, which said spirit is good and matter is evil. So it was a time of great ferment. One of the things that happened before the Gregorian reform is the rise of the Holy Roman Empire. And so you have, to help fill the power vacuum in the northern part of Europe, you have the creation of the Holy Roman Empire, which, as one of my friends keeps saying, is neither holy nor Roman, but Germanic princes who would elect one of their number to sort of keep a cohesive group and to keep some kind of peace and among all these vassals and warlords who were pretty militaristic. But by the time of the 11th century, you have more of a rise in the cities. People moved back into the cities. The trade routes were open. There was communication between the different countries in Europe. You have the rise of the fairs in the fair cities where you had people traveling the roads and trading, people moving into the cities. You also have now a struggle between the Pope and the Emperor, a power struggle where they would claim the allegiance of the peoples. And part of the problem, the argument was over which cities were controlled by which of the two, and also the appointment of bishops. Historically, in many parts of the world, the world being Europe at the time, the princes would be able to appoint the bishops, and as the church was losing power, the popes tried to claim that privilege for themselves. Historically, they speak of the problem of lay investiture. So you have a struggle now between the temporal and the spiritual, or those aren't even the right words to use. You have a struggle between the papacy and the empire. In the cities, you have, because of trade, you have people who are developing the ability to amass money. It's no longer a barter society, and you have some people who are very rich. We can all put Francis's father in this category. And you have some of the people who are saying, Pope, Emperor. What about option C? Like goodbye to both of them? Let's have determination of our own commune. So let's get rid of both of them and say, it's us. We can determine our own life by statutes, by agreements. And so you have a third category coming into play. These people in Italy were called the minores, as opposed to the nobility, the majority. So it's a time of great ferment, but a time of great dissension. Assisi, or a place where we're going to investigate, was an imperial city. The Rocca Maggiore, the castle on the top of the city, was occupied by the forces of the Duke of Spoleto, who was a vassal of the Holy Roman Emperor. You had people coming into the city from outside. One of these people was the grandfather of Clare, who was the castle, the lord of the castle of Murano between Assisi and Gualdo Tadino. That was their ancestral home. But probably in the mid-11th century, he and many of the other lords of the area came in and built houses. So let's talk about who is Chiara di Assisi. Thanks to Gemma Fortini, the daughter of the great Arnaldo Fortini, the mayor of Assisi for many years, who basically, being mayor of Assisi, didn't have anything to do except to comb all the archives, and wrote one of the biggest books about setting Francis and Clare and the whole Franciscan story into the context of Assisi at that time. Here we see the genealogy of St. Clare. There's a comparable genealogy of St. Francis, which goes back 2 generations before him and 2 generations after him, which we know definitively the line died out. But we could see that Clare, on her mother's side, descended from Charlemagne, the first of the Holy Roman Emperors, 800 AD. Interestingly enough, on her mother's side, she has a common ancestor with her father's side, so that Ottone married the son of Ramone, married a daughter of one of the descendants of Charlemagne. So on both her mother's and father's side, she's extremely powerful as the world of medieval times goes. Francis, not at all. And this also involves another person, the person of San Rufinus. Clare's family, when they moved into the city of Assisi, built a house near the brand new church of San Rufino on the top of the city, where, of course, there's more light and air, and also a secure system of water, because the tower that you can barely see here in the picture of the cathedral is built on a Roman cistern. And the canons of this cathedral, who enjoyed the support of the people, of the nobility, also had a guaranteed water supply. And in the Middle Ages, when the most common type of warfare was siege, you really needed water. So throughout the years, the power structure in Assisi moved from the old Roman Forum and the piazza to the top of the city, where the new Cathedral of San Rufinus had been built. This was also important to the people because they wanted to have people coming to the city to pray to St. Rufinus. Very many people praying to St. Petronius, and so the city became more influential. So there was the Bishop of Assisi, the first martyr, who they knew nothing about. So they, in typical medieval fashion, went and looked for more information about St. Rufinus, found this wonderful life of him, and they created this wonderful story, and which was also popularized by St. Peter Damian, a very famous and important preacher of the period. So the city set about building first a small cathedral a small basilica in honor of St. Rufinus, and then as the city and the canons of St. Rufinus, under the influence of Pope Gregory VII, decided they needed a much bigger, wonderful, beautiful cathedral because of all the pilgrims who were going to come, drawn by the story of St. Rufinus and his heroic martyrdom. Interestingly enough, Assisi is a city of pilgrims, but a lot of people don't bother going to St. Rufinus. As I mentioned before, he died in 280 AD under the Romans. Here at the tympanum, which probably was there at the time of Francis and Clare, we see St. Rufinus, the martyr, and St. Victorinus, the second bishop of Assisi, also a martyr, Our Lady, probably the patrons who commissioned the work, and in the center, Christ in glory with a stigmata, the moon, and the stars. And this is something Clare and Francis saw every day. That the city was dedicated to Saint Rufinus, and he was a powerful person. We're talking about this because, interestingly enough, in the nobles who built their houses around the city of Assisi, around the new church of San Rufinos, established a consortium, a mutual support society. So no longer only vassals of the Duke and the Emperor, but they're going to help one another and defend one another and share goods with one another and treat one another equitably. And this is a document, an actual photo of the document, which I was able to hold in my hands years ago, in which the consortium, the consorts of this group, pledged all of these things to one another and to the canons of St. Rufinus. And one of the signatures was Offroduccio, the grandfather of Clare. And in a codicil attached to it, Offroduccio and his brother thank the canons for the beautiful new piazza that they have built, which now give more light and air to his house, and promise that from this day forward, they and their descendants will never raise their house any higher than the new cathedral, the new church. Most recent research, the people at the cathedral claim that the Cathedral of Assisi was changed from St. Mary Major, where it had been since Roman times, to the Church of St. Rufinus in the year 1030. I don't know if I agree with that. It's still problematic. But one important thing is, we know in the ancient church there was only baptism in the cathedral, and so at some point in history, the baptistry was moved from the cathedral at St. Mary Major to the new cathedral at San Rufino. These slides just illustrate this is where tradition and not scientific research shows the house of Clare once stood, right next to the cathedral. This is the piazza. So actually, by building next to the piazza, by creating the piazza right next to their house, the sons of Offroduccio and their descendants really, their property really, really grew. This is the very interesting main entrance, well, the secondary entrance to the cathedral as it stands now. Of course, you know, there's a lot of money went into this trace work, beautiful stone carving with the signs of the zodiac on it, which to the medieval people were a religious symbol. Here we have over the door two rampant four-legged animals drinking water. But interestingly enough, right inside that door, you have the Roman cistern on which the tower is based and built. But more interesting, on the other side, you have two birds of paradise, two peacocks, signs of eternal life, drinking from the fountain, the waters of eternal life. And right behind that door, the baptistry. The baptistry where Francis and Clare and many other people were baptized. So this is the starting point for Clare. This is the starting point for Francis and their introduction into Christian life. But it's in a time of unrest, and it's a time of upheaval. We don't know when the cathedral was consecrated. We know that the facade would have been there in Francis and Clare's time. I was interested in a point of history that was on a book in a bookstore in Assisi, and I asked the owner of the bookstore, I said, Marco, would Francis and Clare have seen that tracery on this door here, which had some reference to a minor writer of the time who got embroiled in many of the Franciscans' things. And he said, the people of Assisi tell a story that, you know, as Francis Francis's father was not in town when the child was born, and his mother had him baptized in the name of John the Baptist, and Pietro came back from a business trip and said, I don't want him called Giovanni, I want him called Francesco. So he went to the priest and said, could you please change the records? And the priest said, sorry, he's baptized. The records show that his name is Giovanni, that's it. And Pietro, having more money than he knew what to do with it, said simply, how much would it cost to build a new rose window on the cathedral? I don't know, nice legend, but probably not true. But this is what Francis and Clare would have seen. This is where they would have come for Sunday Mass, at least. And Clare would have lived right near there. Until one time, Francis was invited here to preach the Lenten retreat. He was able to preach every Sunday throughout Lent. And Clare was really, really attracted to what he said about living the gospel. We know that she arranged clandestine meetings with him in which she told him her heart's desire. And I think the research now shows that the Bishop of Assisi, Bishop Guido, was complicit in the whole plot. He definitely was a supporter of Francis and was a supporter of Clare as well, to most recent thinking. I've suspected as much for a long time, and I think a lot of people are beginning to agree. We have a very interesting image of Clare, a tavola, that comes to us from the 13th century, and I'd like to use it to tell her story. Okay, this is called the Tavola of St. Clare, or the Dossal of St. Clare. A dossal is an altar piece, usually has two pieces hanging out on the side. It's more technically called a tavola because it's painted on wood, not canvas. So I refer to it as the tavola, or the wooden table of St. Clare. To the best of our knowledge, it was commissioned by Benedetta. Benedetta was the abbess after Clare in 1282. Now, this is almost 30 years after the death of Clare. It's been hanging in the monastery or the Basilica of St. Clare since the time of Clare, since the 13th century, more than 800 years. And it's a type of an artwork where the centerpiece is the character shown as a saint, a powerful intercessor bigger than life, and his or her story is told in the 8 frames that are surrounded. I think you've seen this picture many, many times. If you've been to Assisi and you look in the corner by the altar, you'll see it hanging there. It's enormous, probably about 15 feet tall, my guess. Can't get near it. And because it's old, the pictures aren't clear. But it starts down here. You always read one of these pieces in this direction, starting at the lower left, going up and around. So we have here the story of Clare on Palm Sunday. Traditionally, they say 12:12. Now some people are saying 12:10. Some people are saying 12:11. But it's Palm Sunday, the first day of Holy Week. And tradition, of course, in Assisi, even to this day, if you're a real good Catholic, you go to Sunday Mass at the cathedral, not the parish churches that aren't even very many of them in Assisi. And in Clare's day, it was a tradition that the young women of marriageable age would proceed to the altar to receive the palm, actually an olive branch, from the bishop. Sort of like a debutante walk. The girls would, of course, wear their best, Sunday best clothing, because they want to look in the best light. Because all of the guys, the women traditionally did not go out of the house. Young women, young maidens, even more so. So this was their first chance, or their only chance of the year, to really be seen in processing up the center aisle, probably taking a good long time doing it. Of course, they would be looking, eyes cast down modestly, very discreetly, but knowing that all eyes were on them. Hey, look me over. You're interested to see my father make a deal? Get ready for marriage. For some reason, Claire didn't go. Was she saying, no, no, don't even consider me? I've had a number of suitors. I've turned them all down. I want something else. Or was it a plan where the bishop said, don't come to me if everything's okay. I'll give you a signal that everything's ready. It's up to you to figure out. The next thing that happens isn't on the dossal, on the tavola, and that is that night, that very night, which according to medieval reckoning then would have been Holy Monday, Monday of Holy Week. In the dark of night, Claire left home. Traditionally, it shows her accompanied by a faithful servant. That's not held up by the sources. She left home alone. And because she could not go out the front door, which would have been locked and guarded, there was probably a delivery entrance, a servant's entrance, a very small door at the back of the garden, and it was barred with a bar and wood piled in front of it. And the sources tell us, miracle of miracles, Claire managed to leave by that door. Despite her frail, feminine physique, she managed to get all that wood out of there, unbar the door, and went out. This was later identified with the doors of the dead, with the tradition that you only take the dead out the back door because you don't want death ruining your front door, and that Claire went through the door of the dead, but this is just pious drivel. There was no door of the dead in that house. It was a garden door, and she managed to get out. And she went through the city, from the very top of the city down to the Porta Moiano at the bottom of the city. Why didn't she go out the city gate that was closest to her house? Hello, it was locked and guarded. The gates were closed at sunset. How did she get out? Was it a miracle? The Porta Moiano was in the bishop's section of the city. The guards at the Porta Moiano, the gate of Moiano, would have been the bishop's soldiers. He probably cleared the way and said, hey, when you get a signal, look the other way, don't see anything, open the gates. The bishop, again, complicit in the story. I believe, and I think most modern research is holding up to that. Last year, 2 years ago now, I went up to Assisi when they were dedicating the new museum in honor of the people of Assisi who had sheltered the Jews. And it's in the bishop's residence complex. And I went out into the garden at the end of the tour of the museum, and I got locked in the garden because, well, it is so close, and literally I could have walked onto the top of the tower of the Porta Moiano, where the guards would have been guarding the door, the gate of the city, and opening it for Claire. Not a miracle. Well, and unless you want to have a miracle, that the bishop was complicit in this story. Okay, so our first story down in the bottom of the tavola is the Bishop of Assisi handing the palm, the olive branch to Claire, to me, the signal. The second episode is right outside the gate, the brothers wait for Claire. And they take her down to the Porziocolo where Francis is waiting for her. The image here shows her accompanied by a bunch of people, but these people are saints in heaven who were protecting her. But at the center of the image here, you see Francis and Clare together. But Francis and his brothers who welcomed her into their fraternity. And then Francis, with the brothers as witness, gives her the tonsure and receives her into his way of gospel living. You notice here, there are no women accompanying her, no saints accompanying her. It is Francis and the brothers who are welcoming her. The tonsure, or trimming the hair of a woman, you know, her beauty, is a sign of consecration. Okay, that's a story we all know and are familiar with. So this monastery had the privilege of sanctuary. Nobody could defile it. So there they are, Francis and Clare. Francis takes Clare there to the monastery. The sisters welcome her, I should say the nuns for her. She has control of money, her dowry. She's taking it out of their grasp. They're not happy. They come to take her. The place has sanctuary. She clings to the altar. The nuns are looking on. This is her uncle Manaldus, who was the major brother, the first brother, the lord of the house. In Clare's house, there were 7 knights that we were told. Clare clings to the altar, shows that her hair has been shorn, she has been dedicated to God, and they say, what are we going to do? Can't do anything. So they leave. And so does Clare. For some reason or another, they take her away from St. Paul's. Why? Did the nuns not want to risk the wrath of a very influential family? Did the nuns, when they agreed to accept her, think she was coming as a nun with her servants and her dowry and her money? And they found out a little bit differently. She brought no servants, she brought no dowry. She would have been a lay sister, not a choir sister. Did they think it would not be appropriate to have the firstborn daughter of one of the most influential knights of the city as a lay sister? And did they say to Francis, look, you're crazy enough. We don't think she's has a vocation to our way of life. You better find someplace else for her. Or did Clare just say, no, this is not what I want? So then they took her to Sant'Angelo de Panzo, a monastery that was not a Benedictine, but it was on the side of Subasio. And it was less structured. And within the first week, Clare's sister, Catherine, joined her. Now, Sant'Angelo did not have the sanctuary privileges that San Paolo did. So Manaldus and the knights come after Catherine, and they try dragging her away. She tries clinging to the altar. They can violate the sanctuary there, and they try lugging her, dragging her away, but they can't lift her. 7 knights can't lift this one girl. Well, Manaldus is so frustrated, so angry, he raises his fist, which of course, because he's dressed in male armor, would have been clad in metal, truly an iron fist, and was ready to strike her when suddenly his arm froze. Was it apoplexy? Was it a stroke? What is it? Well, the sources tell us it's Clare intervening and Francis and Clare praying for her protection. Uncle Manaldus was hauled away by the others, and Catherine was able to stay. When Francis heard the story, he said to her, "Oh, wow, you are so brave. You were ready to suffer martyrdom just like St. Agnes. From here on in, we'll call you Agnes." And so that's how Clare's sister Catherine became Agnes. It's also how they ended up leaving Sant'Angelo. And the third time's a charm, and Francis led her to San Damiano, where she lived her life in peace with her sisters, a life that wasn't very eventful from what we know. There were a few stories that we'll tell a bit later, but she lived that life with her sisters. That's what's important. This is a story, the only story of Clare's 30-some years in the monastery, 40 probably, in the monastery that talks about her life there. And it happened one day when the friars had somebody had given them a loaf of bread, one loaf of bread. Now, the sisters worked and spun yarn and wove cloth and embroidered linens for the churches and sent the friars throughout the whole valley to donate the work of their hands to poor churches. They didn't sell them. Maybe the friars would come back with some couple zucchini, eggplant, the staples of the diet, if they were even existing at that time, I don't know. Bread. The friars would beg for the sisters if they needed something, and the friars also lived at San Damiano. So one day they came back with a whole loaf of bread. So Clare cut it in half, sent half to the friars, and put it on the table for the sisters. Came time to eat, they said to Clare, "Well, all we have is a half of loaf of bread." She says, "Okay." She blessed it and said, "Cut it into slices." Now, you better realize there were 50 sisters in the house at the time. And because Clare prayed over that bread, they were able to get 50 nice, thick slices, the sources tell us. And everybody ate. Yes, it reminds us of the multiplication of the bread, but also it was a story that they told after her death to show about her faith, her tenacity, her love of the sisters, the holiness of her life. Then we have the deathbed scene of Clare. A number of sisters said that as Clare lay dying, they saw a group of virgins, and one with a golden robe and a golden crown, dancing around her bed. They saw that as a heavenly vision that Clare's soul was ready to go, and the visions of heaven. Here in the image, I love this, you see the heavenly figures, but you also see the sisters here in the background, but they're seeing the vision. They're not looking at Clare, they see the vision. And the last of the 8 celebrates the funeral and doesn't want to have the funeral mass. He wants to have the Mass of Virgins. And, the cardinals have to hold the Pope back sometimes. And they said to him, "Your Holiness, that's not a good idea. We have to have now there's a rule that you have to have a trial, a process of canonization, and you don't want to be one of the first people to break that rule we just made. So no, it would not be good to have the Mass of Virgins. You better have a funeral Mass. So the Pope came and had the funeral Mass. He was, by the way, he was in Perugia, very close to Assisi, and had visited her 2 days before, and at that point approved the rule that she had written. She just, on her deathbed, said, oh, by the way, Holy Father, I've written in my own rule, would you please approve it? And out of affection for her, he did so. Now, this is interesting, right? The 8 pictures, why? Why these 8? Here we have the whole tabula. I only did this at 9 o'clock this morning, so this wasn't in my dress rehearsal. Okay. So here we have the 8 images around the central figure, and I mentioned about reading around them. But you also read them across. So that, let's look at the 2 down on the bottom. Here we see the bishop handing the palm to Clare. Here we see the Pope officiating at her funeral, in some way recognizing the meritorious end of her life. Here we have him saying, go, do what you have proposed. Here we have the church, the institutional church, saying, congratulations, you did what you wanted to do. You held true to the end. Here we have that questionable thing of why, when there are more important stories, do you have Francis and the brothers welcoming Clare to the Porziuncola? Because over here you have the maidens, the Queen, welcoming Clare into heaven. You see the parallels. Here we have Francis and Clare and the brothers. And Francis, when he accepts her, says, we will provide for you. I promise, for my part and that of my brothers, that we will provide for you. Here we have Clare providing for the sisters. And also Clare saying, as always, God provides. Here, this is the easiest one. Clare being saved, rescued from her family, and Catherine/Agnes being rescued from her family's attempt. But we also know that the 2 images that are closest to the heart of the person are what the creator, the writer of the icon, believes is most important. So what do we see as most important about the life of Clare? Her relationship to the Fraternity of the Friars and to Francis, and her relationship with her sisters. I think that's powerful because, you know, we think of Clare in many ways, but she was the mother. She was the Lady Clare, the mother of all the sisters. Okay, I'm going to get out of this and back to just a little bit about what we know about Clare comes to us from the legends of Francis, the stories of Francis. And remember I said they needed to have the eyewitnesses, the process of canonization? We actually have the manuscript of the witnesses and what they said about Clare. So Clare died on August 11th, 1253. On November 24th, the Bishop of Spoleto, who had received a papal appointment like 6 days earlier to investigate the life and holiness of the Virgin Clare of Assisi, went to San Damiano accompanied by a scribe and 2 witnesses and interviewed the sisters. So we have, to this day, the list of who gave testimony. We have Sister Pacifica, or Pacifica, who was the daughter of Guelfuccio of Assisi, who was a distant cousin of Clare, who lived nearby. Her father was one of the consorti who signed the document, her grandfather, about the Church of San Rufino. So she knew Clare from the time of their childhood. She accompanied Clare's mother on pilgrimages. She said she went with her beyond the sea, which would be either Santiago or to the Holy Land. We know Clare's mother did both, and to the shrine of the St. Michael in Gargano, and to Rome. She says that she entered at the same time as Clare, and some people say she went with Clare, leaving the house that night. But I think Pacifica would have said it if she had been. She, like all the others, answered these questions. Tell us about the manner of life. And they all said that Clare was very holy. They gave different examples of things that she did, and also that she healed the sisters. How? By her prayer, often blessing them with oil, mumbling a prayer which they never knew what she said, because she said it very, very slowly, very lowly, not to bring attention to herself. One example, one witness says one time she said the Lord's Prayer, but we don't know anything else that she said. But many sisters were healed, and by Clare's prayer, and also the people of Assisi and the area. They tell of a little boy who put a pebble up his nose, and they couldn't get it out, and they brought him to Clare, and she prayed over him, and the pebble came out. They talk about a friar who was insane, and Francis sent him to Clare, and she told him to sleep that night in the garden, and the next morning he woke up. Benvenuta of Perugia, who knew Clare when she and her family lived in exile there after the uprising that we didn't talk about. And she said that she entered the community in September of the same year that Clare had entered on Holy Monday. We have Philippa, who entered 4 years after Clare. She's the one who tells us about the Christmas story when Clare, the year before she died, was left alone in the infirmary while the sisters prayed matins, and she was rather despondent and grumbling to the Lord, and she was miraculously able to hear matins from the Church of St. Francis way on the other side of town. We have Philippa, the daughter of Lord Leonardo de Gislerio, who also told us about a vision that Clare told her about, where she was climbing a staircase and Francis was at the top, and she was very thirsty, and she climbed this very long staircase to reach to Francis. And when she said she was thirsty, he uncovered his breast and gave her his breast, and she had drunk from his side. The nipple remained in his mouth, in her mouth, and it was pure gold. Obviously a dream or a vision that bothered her because she shared it with others. There's a lot of stuff written now about that vision and what it might mean. Amata, there's her patron, Amata, who was Clare's niece. Mr. Martino of Corcorano was Clare's father's brother, her uncle. Sister Christiana, who tells us about one time, just a few years before Clare's death, when she was able to get out of bed and a very heavy door fell on top of her, and they all said, oh my God, she's gone. I mean, she's so weak and she's dead. Christiana called for help, and everybody came, and they picked up the door off of Clare. It took how many of them to lift it, and she was fine. Sister Cecilia, who's the one who talks about in great detail the story of the half of loaf of bread with the large and good slices. She came to the monastery 3 years after Clare, and she also must have been a bit of a journalist. She interviewed Ortolana, and it was to her that Ortolana told about the vision that she had before Clare was born, in which she was worried about the dangers of childbirth and said, I just heard a voice telling me that this child will be a light to so many. And so I decided to name her Chiara. Balvina, another niece of Clare, also tells us about the nativity when she got to hear the story of Clare hearing matins, but also mentioned that Clare saved Assisi through her prayer. But it's not until Francesca, who tells us in great detail the story, which unfortunately has become twisted around. They show, Balvina tells us very clearly that the emperor's troops were trying to invade the city, and they were coming up from the valley. They were on the Flaminian Way, which Assisi overlooks and protects the Flaminian Way. And the mercenary troops hired by the emperor, who were Saracens, Turks, Muslims, had already climbed over the wall and were in the garden. This is dangerous, okay? Women are the spoils of war. Rape and plunder common. I mean, they weren't even going up to Assisi yet. They weren't attacking the city walls. They were attacking San Damiano, which is outside the city walls. Clare sent for the box containing the Eucharist, we would say the tabernacle, which was kept upstairs in the oratory in a little niche in the wall. And she had it brought down, she had the box brought down to the dining room, and she placed it in front of the door that leads out into the garden where the Saracens already were. The door was closed. She's no fool. She had the sisters help her to kneel before the box with the Eucharist inside, in front of the closed door, and said, Lord, protect these women and this city. And the sisters said they heard the child's voice say, I have protected it before and I will protect it still. So all those pictures you see of Clare standing there holding the monstrance out of the second floor door are poppycock. It's Francesca who tells us the real story, how Clare put her faith in the Eucharist and was able then to save the city, for which she is honored. I see we're running out of time, so we're going to go a little bit faster. These are the other witnesses. On November 28th, they came back and investigated and asked Sister Balvina of Porzano, who had been in the infirmary when they came, and the whole community gathered together, and Sister Benedetta, abbess of San Damiano, and the whole community said they find nothing in her life. She was exemplary and was wonderful always. Lord Ugolino, Lord Ranieri, Lady Bona tells us that she was the one, her sister is Pacifica, who's in the community, but Lady Bona, who did not enter, was the one who says, I accompanied her to her meetings with St. Francis before she entered. Lord Ranieri tells us how beautiful she was and says, I even asked for her hand, but I was not even among the short list. Lord Ugolino tells how he had sent his wife back 23 years earlier, and Clare said she had a vision that he should take her back, and he would have a son who would do him proud, and so it was. This is a statue of St. Clare You notice her holding the Eucharist, not historically accurate, and it's so historically inaccurate, you can't see the 4 knots on her cincture. It drives me crazy because they represent the vows. This is the statue we see outside San Damiano, and this is the door where they all say that Clare held the Eucharist up, and the Saracens, who were down here, by the way, not here, fled in fear. There's the refectory door overlooking the garden. And this is the oratory. This is where the box with the Eucharist was kept. And this was obviously done after Clare's life. It's the second layer of fresco painting in the small oratory. And it shows Clare pointing to the sisters saying, protect them. And it was from, and you see Christ here is depicted as a small child. Throughout the process of canonization, they speak of her being seen with a small child on her lap. And so the image of the Eucharistic Jesus for the sisters, for the ladies at San Damiano, is particularly a small child. Does that make them almost a Madonna with the child on the lap? I don't know. But the best way to get to know Clare is in her own words. We have 4 letters that she wrote to Agnes of Prague and a spurious letter to Ermentrude of Bruges. Most scholars don't count that as accurate. Agnes of Prague was the daughter of King Ottokar I, and then in 1230, upon the death of Ottokar, her brother Wenceslas II succeeded to the throne. And there was a lot of women's groups within all of Europe who were living a different way of life, not the monastic way of life. And the Pope at the time, Honorius III, commissioned his nephew, Cardinal Ugolino, to get all these gals together and write one rule for all of them and get all the ducks in a row. Well, Ugolino actually wrote a rule for them based on the Benedictine rule, said they had to follow the rule, and he called this group the Poor Enclosed Ladies, the Order of the Poor Enclosed Ladies of St. Damien. And Clare would have none of it, because one of the things is the church was insisting that they have property, real estate where they could have olives and workers to work their land for them so that they would pray, and they would be amassing wealth. And Clare would have none of this. She refused to join the Order of St. Damien, as a matter of fact. And so she was able to exact from one pope after the next the possibility to live in poverty without any property. Well, in 1232, I think, friars came to Prague, the capital of Bohemia, and settled there. And the daughter of the king of, I said 1232, so the sister of the king of Bohemia became very interested in living the same life Clare did. So she took her dowry and built a hospital for the sick and created an order of men nurses who would care for the sick there, the Knights of the Red Cross. And she endowed this monastery separately, this hospice separately, and also built a monastery for women, invited some of the women from San Damiano to come and settle there. And she and 6 of the most noble women of Prague entered the monastery, which had no possessions. She had endowed the hospice, but not the monastery. She was insisting on absolute poverty, like Clare. This was not going to go over well. This is, we have 4 letters from Clare. The first is the time that that Agnes entered. The next one from the year later. And then 2 years later, when things were really bad and the Pope had intervened and said, no, no, the monastery and the hospice are endowed, and you have to have money to support the sisters. And Clare basically says, hold on to what you dream. Hold on. What you hold may you always hold. Hold on. Now, Clare and Agnes had never met, but Clare was noble. Agnes was royal. In the same time period, we have a letter from the Pope asking King Wenceslas for troops, 20,000 troops for an army he was amassing to fight the emperor. And the Vatican archives, we still have the letter that Wenceslas wrote back saying, oh, most holy Father, of course I will send the troops. I am your loyal and obedient servant. I will honor your request and do what you ask. Oh, by the way, did you get my sister's letter? She's asking for the privilege of poverty, just like they have at San Damiano in Assisi. So please remember her request as I honor your request. Clare was no dummy. She knew a princess outweighs a noble woman. She wanted her dream to be shared by Agnes and the women in Prague, and she would encourage this. Then the fourth letter we have is also basically right before her death, in which she takes leave of Agnes and renews that friendship. There were probably other letters, only 4 are existing. Okay, I think that's all I need to say, except if you're looking for more, one of the more recent books, oh dear. We have the work of Marco Bartoli translated into English. That's a good readable book. Frances Teresa Downing is working on a series of 5 books. I like her 3rd book, it's the most fun. She has done her own translation of the writings of Clare. FT, as we call her, does speak good Italian, and she's lived a life. She's a poor Clare in her 80s. I think she's 82 now. Maria Piavazzoni is a doctor in history, a laywoman with no connection to the Franciscan movement, and so really has no problem, no horse in the race. And she and her students have done so much research into the Order of St. Damien and Ugolino's efforts. And their work is mind-boggling. And recently I came upon, I knew about the Franciscan intellectual tradition, but I was desperate because I'm here in Pittsburgh and my books are in Rome. And I thought maybe I could find them online. And I found out that if you go to the Franciscan tradition, www.franciscantradition, you can join up for absolutely no money at all and have access to all the medieval sources free of charge. Download them, read them online. So it's www.franciscantradition.org. And the best way to know more about Clare is to read what she wrote. I think you got a picture of Clare's tenacity, of her importance in just importance of following Christ steadfastly, doing what we are called to do. And I hope, you could pick up, the process of canonization is fun reading. I love it. One of the sisters said about how holy she was, how prayerful she was, how kind she was. And they said, and how do you know these things? And she said, I lived with her. So I hope someday some of you could say the same thing, probably not. I lived with her. And that's also what we're called to be. holy to one another, encouraging one another, feeding one another. So I guess I'll say goodbye.
Nancy,
Yes, Verge?
Frances used to go to the lepers. Did she leave her monastery and go to the lepers and work like that?
San Damiano historically was a hospice. It's outside the city of Assisi. There's evidence that it was a pagan site of healing. There is running water there. And my own theory, and this is substantiated by the friars when they did research there, archaeological research, it was a pagan healing site, and the pagan healing sites, when Christianity came to the fore, became dedicated to Cosmas and Damian, the physician twins. Assisi had been dedicated in Roman times to Castor and Pollux, the twin gods, well, half god, half mortal, because they were the children of Zeus and Leda. And so these shrines then became dedicated to Cosmas and Damian. And in pagan times, you would sleep at the shrine and the gods would come at night and heal you. Christianity, this became the same thing. I was recently in the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua in Rome, and it blew my mind because they had the oratory there of the 7 holy healers, and they have a recreation with the artwork that has been restored. This church has just been opened for the first time in 100-some years, and it's in the Roman Forum. That's how ancient it is. And there they showed how the people would come and light candles and pray to the 7 holy healers, and they would be healed as they came to them at night. So that because people would come there at night, rich and people from the city would come down and take care of them. This would not be lepers. The lepers were down in the valley. But, you know, our English word hospital and hospice and hotel all come from the same Latin word. And so the sick would stay there, and travelers who did not make it into the city before the gates were closed could stay there, and it could be like a hotel. And we have Jacques de Vitry, a bishop from Flanders, who came to Rome in he came to Perugia because the Pope was in Perugia in July of 1216. And when he got there, he found out the Pope had died. And Jacques wrote lots of letters. And one of his letters home, he wrote about these the lesser brothers and sisters who would be tending the sick and the lepers in hospitals around Assisi. Who were these lesser sisters? We don't know. We know who the lesser brothers were, but I think at that point we definitely can say that they were, they may have left San Damiano to go and take care of the women lepers down on the plain, right down below them, right down below San Damiano. The enclosure probably was not as strict as it is today. Matter of fact, one time they bring somebody to Claire and she says, "Take him to my mother." Now she didn't say, "Call my mother to the grill." Take him to my mother. So she was at one point of access and had to take him to somewhere else where Ortolano could pray over him. We don't know, but yes, I think so. Mm-hmm. So I guess we'll say good morning. May the Lord give you peace.